You know Baldur's Gate 3 is not actually a good game when every single time someone disputes its quality or its credentials, the fanboys respond with, but it won all those game awards. As if video game journalism isn't corrupt and hasn't been pushing like garbage products for years. Like, do you not remember The Last of Us Part 2? Like, do you not remember Dragon Age Inquisition? Do you not remember Skyrim, like do you not remember like the past several decades of this bullshit? Like, they made Sonic the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise viable when like it objectively never could compete with Mario in any way, shape, or form. Right? Game journalists have always been corrupt, always, and yet nobody ever wants to admit it, right? And because of Gamergate 2, because it's becoming more and more apparent that game journals are trying to push an agenda and they're trying to warp people's perspective on things, and like they're trying to do things like steer people away from Nintendo hardware and support the other hardware instead, right? Matt Piscatella just released an article talking about how like the Switch wasn't going to be viable in the near future, right? Like you're always seeing them doing this, right? It's not rooted in anything real. It's not rooted in reality at all, right? Like you don't have to get new hardware every year, bro. But these guys are stuck in this mindset that like consoles need to be like phones, right? That you have to like buy one once and you have to buy one every year to get like new specs and so developers can take full advantage of them, even though games take several years to develop. Like it doesn't make sense to put out new hardware every year. And yet you're seeing these game journals like sit there and try to tell you that like, oh, the Switch, it's struggling to run Princess Peach Showtime. It's struggling to run One Piece Odyssey. It's struggling to run like Tears of the Kingdom when in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, right? They're doing all this stunt. They're pulling all these tricks, like trying to gaslight you into thinking the Switch is a bad console, but in a reality, it's not it's not based in reality at all, right? In reality, the Switch is dominating the gaming industry even now and will continue to do so, I imagine, until GTA 6 comes out. Like at this point, I don't think anything other than Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to make the PS5 and the Series X more viable than Nintendo Switch. And realistically, that's going to last like what, a year, where like everybody goes out, buys Grand Theft Auto 6, and then they kind of realize they're like, wow, 5 was better, right? They have that like, that huge revelation moment where like they realize how woke the game is and how disappointing it is and how it hasn't like innovated at all from 5 and stuff like that. Like the game journals are going to be on damage control about that. They already have to a certain extent because people tried like when the leaks first started coming out and people started talking about like the setting, like people tried like people were pointing out, they're like, yeah, the game's probably going to be awoke, right? Like and IGN tried spinning the story into being like, oh, gamers don't want Hispanic women in their Grand Theft Auto game or whatever. Well, that's not really the issue, right? They tried warping the people's reaction to this trailer. Like, I do think there are lots of reservations about that upcoming release. And I do think game journals are going to religiously defend the game in spite of those issues. Right? I do think they are going to give this game a 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10s, and I imagine are going to try and like push Grand Theft Auto 6 as being one of the best games ever made, and something that like topples Breath of the Wild as like the most critically acclaimed game of the generation. Maybe, right? Like yeah, we saw this with Grand Theft Auto 5 for sure. That game was clearly not as good as San Andreas, but it was worshipped when it came out. Because like yeah, again, like things have not changed in like the past several years. Like when Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, like there was nothing on PS4, PS3 or Xbox 360 either, right? So now like the gaming industry is going to have to throw everything they have at Grand Theft Auto 6 to try and make this brand viable, to try to make the PlayStation consoles viable. Like it does kind of feel like at this point that Grand Theft Auto 6 is the only thing keeping these platforms relevant, right? I think even game journals have acknowledged this. I've seen articles about this, about how like Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to save the generation, but it's really not. Like people are going to buy Grand Theft Auto 6 and then they're going to put it down and then they're going to play a Nintendo console, right? That is, I think, the end point of like pushing Grand Theft Auto 6, right? It's going to be the same thing that happened to that happened with Grand Theft Auto 5, right? The audience is not interested in playing other video games. All they want to do is drive around in nice cars and shoot cops. That's it. Grand Theft Auto has no appeal outside of that, right? Grand Theft Auto is not like the edgy thing it used to be. So I think this very well may be the beginning of the end of the franchise. Do I expect the game to sell well? Yes. Do I expect do I expect it to be critically acclaimed? Yes. Do I expect people to like pretend the game is good for the first year or so? Yes. But there is going to be a very notable decline as the game's life cycle goes on, where people slowly begin to accept that Grand Theft Auto 6 is not as good as 5. And I think this is going to be the pattern when it comes to a lot of the products that game journals are pushing. You know, they push Street Fighter 6, they push Baldur's Gate 3. They tried to say Diablo 4 was good again at one point. They tried, they tried defending Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? I remember when that came out, right? Like after they dropped the bikini trailer, like people were doing this thing. We're like, oh, this is the most critically acclaimed Final Fantasy game ever. When like and now seeing how badly it's bombed, how bad, how there's no enthusiasm for it. Like I think that speaks volumes as to like where the industry is headed. Like you cannot produce sequels. Like if you can't like keep people invested enough in your property to want to keep playing through it and like get through the entire thing like 100% completed, right? If they don't beat that game, they're not necessarily going to come out for the sequel. And that's the issue that like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has had, is that like the majority of people were unhappy with remake, never finished it, and now you're asking these people to come back for the sequel, which has a lot of the same problems and learned a lot nothing from the original. Like, no, that simply isn't going to happen. The reality is that nobody really pays attention to game journalists anymore. Matt Piscatella released an article about the Switch, right? Like, oh, Nintendo needs to get rid of their exclusive titles. They need to start going multi-plat. Like, nobody outside of NeoGaf cares. And unlike 10 years ago, where NeoGaf was like on top of the world and controlled the online gaming space, like now they're a joke. They're a shell of their former selves. And like those people have to compete with like the reality that people on Twitter are calling out people like Matt Piscatella, like Zugi X, Daniel Ahmed, like the Benji sales guy. Like people are beginning to realize that these sales and analysts are just propagandists, who are desperately trying to push this idea that like Nintendo is failing and that Sony and the third parties are thriving, when in reality, that clearly hasn't been true for a long time. We are going to continue seeing this going forward. But for me personally, I eagerly await the day that gamers wake up to the reality of the current situation of video game journalism and the award shows that it spawns. Baldur's Gate 3 has no credibility whatsoever.